Hello, folks. Welcome to the Scholar's Nook. Will you receive mindful tips for the budding scholar? My name is Dr. Nick Wolf, and I'm with.
Dr. Stephen Lenenberger.
We're glad you're here today. Hello, Stephen. How are you today?
Doing great, Nick. How are you, sir?
Well, I'm doing fantastic. Over the past couple of sessions, we've been wrestling with some pretty weighty topics. And I sense that not only you and I, but our audience probably could use a bit lighter session today. So I think today we'll get to a more of a accessible or easily understood topic: how to efficiently wrap your heads around a journal article. So I'll say that when I started first to read these articles, I just tried to read the articles front to back. And that can be a challenge for students, especially if you're being asked to review 3 or more articles in the course of a week. Over time, I've learned that there are more efficient approaches in how to review an article. So I guess the question I would have for you first, what do you look for? Let's just say you are a student in a PhD or a DBA class, and you are tasked with reviewing some articles here. What do you think are some of the steps that we should use to rapidly build an understanding of those articles?
Well, first of all, Nick, we just talked about a moment ago about how the importance of the quality of the journal article that you're reading, or the source. What's the quality of the source? And, you want to make sure you're selecting an article from a peer-reviewed journal. And as a reminder, a peer-reviewed journal it's a rigorous process to go through a peer-reviewed journal. You have to submit, according to the guidelines of the journal, your article. It's usually about 30 pages long. It's reviewed by 3 to 5 reviewers. You get feedback on it. You have to respond with a letter explaining, which changes you agree with and what you did to make those changes, things you disagree with. Then it goes back to the editor again. And most people who get published, it's 2 or 3 tries or 4 tries. I mean, there's a lot of rejection involved in this. So when we're reading these articles, let's not forget even though they can seem, heavy and dense and confusing at times, don't forget when you're reading these articles, what a process it is for a person to actually get published. It's a huge accomplishment, especially if you're doing it in a top tier journal where the rigor is, unmatched. So keep that in mind. So first of all, I'm looking at the quality of the peer-reviewed source. Is it a top tier journal? Is it a mid-tier journal, lower tier journal? Articles in all of those categories can be useful. I always like to start with the top tier journals and see, what the big issues are, how they're, what they're publishing on the topic.
How do
And then
you suss out
what's
which
that?
are the how do you suss out which are the top tier journals? Is there any
Well,
ways to do that?
yeah, so there's a certain amount of name recognition that if you've been in graduate school for a while, I mean, the Academy of Management Journal, in the field of leadership, for example, Leadership Quarterly, if in your area of study, you've read a lot in these top tier journals, whether you know it or not. So there's name recognition there, but then there's also power ratings. You can look up on different websites, uh, journal power ratings, meaning how often are these journals cited, it's kind of a reputational score. Don't ask me how the math works, but I do believe the higher the power rating, the better it is. It can range. I've seen like 2.5, 3.0. So they're small numbers, but the larger or the bigger the number, the more power the journal has.
Yeah, I
So
think
that's
it's often referred to as the impact factor of the journal.
impact, not power rating. You're right. I beg your pardon. Impact factor. Thank you. And so that those are 2 ways. And then of course ask your advisors, ask people in the field. You know, um, that's the best way to find quality journal sources.
Another good way that I found is I believe that the terms are forward and backward searches, where you can actually, if you're going on, let's say Google Scholar, and in the notes underneath the title, it'll say how many times has this article been cited? Cited by,
Hmm.
so, and then that will allow you to see, that would be a forward search. Say, okay, so what are the additional scholarship that uses this as part of its foundation for additional exploration? And of course, the backward searches is you look through the article that you're looking at here, look at the reference pages and seeing all the foundation that led to this article. That's going to be a
Nice.
backward search. So you always wanted to utilize both a forward and backward search. And obviously, the more times an article is being cited, that is by itself, it's prima facie evidence that it has more influence than other articles.
Hmm. Absolutely. And, on that point too, Nick, those are all excellent points. I think, you know, did the journal publish seminal works? A lot of times you can tell the quality of a journal and then also the impact of it just by, look at a classic study in in your field and whatever it's published in, that's probably a good bet that everything after that's pretty good too. So these are all good points to keep in mind.
Okay, so let's say you have an article in your hand. Maybe you're assigned by a professor or what have you. What are the steps that we would go by just to quickly consume that article in the most efficient way?
When I was in my PhD program at University of Nebraska, one of our lead professors actually did a video on how to read a journal article in 10 minutes or less. And to those of us who are a little OCD, who have to read every word of everything, that was a little off-putting. But once you start realizing you have to cover a lot of, reading a lot of literature really fast to make some choices on what's going to go in your literature review, or if you're even doing just an assignment where you're combining 3 articles together or something for a review, it's important to um, first of all read that title. If that title doesn't make sense, then it's not the right article. If it doesn't include the topic or the idea or the area that you're interested in, then move on. Um, Secondly, look at that abstract. If the abstract makes sense, keep reading. The abstract's going to tell you a little bit about the conclusions. It's going to spoil all the secrets in the article for you so you can get down. And then what I like to do, and what was recommended in this video or this lecture that was developed at University of Nebraska, is go to the findings. What or in the conclusions. What did they find? Then I like to look at the reference page, see what kind of research supported this and what it's branching off of. And then ultimately, I go back into the implications and look for hints on how I might, like if I'm doing dissertation research, in the limitations or implications, what breadcrumbs are left there for me that I can pick up and say, oh, there's a call for this approach to the research or something. And then you can kind of pick it up or replicate the study if you want to too. And of course, the literature reviews invaluable. Once you do all those steps that I just mentioned, then go back to the literature review and kind of start all over again.
I think that's it. That's true, is that this is somewhat of an iterative process, because the first
Yeah,
step, especially when we are doing research to inform a study, the biggest exercise I think when looking through and churning through scholarship is to select out what doesn't is not necessary. So you're prioritizing, you're looking for reasons to dispense with an article so you can get back to the ones that are more appropriate, so that you have a series of things you're looking for in your mind as you start getting into it. And as soon as one of those criteria are missed, then that's a signal to get the thing out. So if
absolutely.
abstract is off, or if the population is not what I'm
Yeah.
interested in, I'm looking for reasons to exclude an article so I can refine my focus on what is more appropriate.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and one I wish I would have made. But that is so critical because you're going to know right off the bat. You're going to, and I don't know if you're like this, Nick, I don't know how many people are like this, but I have a almost a visceral reaction to articles when I read them because it either feels right or it doesn't. You know, there's a little bit of intuition in here too. But aside from that part of it, you're right. If the population doesn't match, if it's like in an industry that's way off of what you're looking at or whatever, these are things that probably you should just keep looking, put it off in the maybe pile or just keep moving. But yeah, there's a little bit of art and science to that process.
Absolutely. So other things that I would add into the process here for consideration after reading the abstract, I want to skim the introduction for the purpose of understanding what the impetus of for the research was about. So why is the person motivated to do this research? Because the more that aligns with my goal, the more likely it's going to be relevant to me. After that, before I get into the implications of the interpretation, I do want to skim the literature review for a few certain things. First of all, if I can see a visual model to really
Hmm.
understand what they're trying to do, that is extremely helpful. So I try to find a visual model, but not all articles have that. Even I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't say the majority of them have one. So the next thing I look for, if I can quickly identify what hypotheses or propositions that they've laid out, I want to have that in my head so I can understand the basic logic of what they're the study and see if it works on its own merits. But even then, sometimes they don't even do that. So that case, I'm going to scan the headings to see what are the relevant constructs that are appropriate to this. At least I have some of the points in a Tinker Toys fashion to start putting together so I can understand what they're trying to get at in very loose, low resolution ways. So after that, though, I'm going to probably look at the results section just because I want to see the tables. I want to see what if because you get a fairly good understanding of their methods and the results just by looking at what output that they have there.
Hmm.
Then I want to at least see if that all makes sense. And this is a more of like a broad sweep skimming thing just to see if if what I again, as you say, the intuition aspects, I would say as I'm reading through the literature review and I'm reading through those high level points as well as the impetus, I want to say, well, I should expect to see this, this, and this, and I want to make sure that all that stuff is there, and that would be a good helpful way to again plug me into the study. And then I will again, as you will say, go to the discussion and implications and see if all that makes sense. And then finally, I'll return to methodology and see
Hmm.
if there are if everything that I see is all in fair alignment, and if I am missing something or if something I expect would be there is not there, that's when I'm going to delve more deeply into what it's actually doing and see if there's any gaps that I can see that are revealed.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'll circle back and reiterate, underscore, um, you know, the method section, that's another place where you can pick up ideas on, wow, here's a novel method I didn't think of, or a little twist where you can try. And models. I was remiss in not mentioning that before. You're absolutely right. Models are so important. We're seeing more and more literature maps also for, the literature reviews. The Creswell really is a big proponent of literature maps, and it really gives you a nice, it's good for the reader, obviously, but it's also good for the researcher because it forces them to concisely make those connections graphically, really draw, kind of show your work a little bit. So, and then you can see those relationships. And again, in those models, you never know when you're going to stumble upon a variable you didn't even think, or you've done research in an unrelated area and you're like, ooh, this variable might be kind of interesting to put in here. So yeah, that's can't stress enough how important the models and the methods section are. Definitely.
And it's interesting when you are looking at maybe parallel research lines from what you're looking at, you may discover a different set of vernacular and terminology that mean
Mm,
essentially the same thing, but you hadn't discovered that, and therefore, because you weren't aware of it, your keyword
yeah.
searches didn't include those terms. So you may all of a sudden discover an entire wing of scholarship that is pertinent to your topic that you weren't aware of until you all of a sudden came across these terms. That's a good thing to keep.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's such a great point. And sometimes in a completely different field, it's like,
Absolutely.
it's amazing how the fields don't communicate very well, but through a good literature review and keeping an open mind, sometimes you can really make those connections between fields and make an even more impactful study or review.
And one of the key things I want to emphasize to our listeners is that as you're consuming an article, you should be reading it actively. And I was trying to clue in with my process and over discussing that overview that as I am reading, I'm looking for questions to ask. And as you are reading, if a question is popping into your head about this, write it down. And there's a good chance that question will be answered. But if it's
Hmm.
left unanswered, that is your intuition talking to you saying, I'm seeing a hole here, and I want to make sure that I'm capturing it so I can ask that question later on. So it's very important that we read actively. And as these questions come to you, capture them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great.
So, and I wanted to change our question a little bit more because we were talking about what if this is how you get your head around the scholarship provided you by a professor, which you could be in that case reasonably sure and confident that the scholarship that you're being presented is reliable, it's robust, and therefore it has been qualified to sit in the course that you're there. But
Hmm.
as we proceed in our careers and as we say for our dissertations and research projects. And then later, as we are doing this independently, we have to be responsible for the scholarship that we consume for our own purposes. And at which point, the level of scrutiny that we should employ to these articles does raise a substantial level here. So I would say, in that case, Stephen, no, what would how would you change your approach in once you get to that level where we now are responsible for not only understanding the article, but giving it a fair amount of scrutiny?
Yeah. Are you, and I'm sorry if I'm missing a beat here, but are we talking about like if you're doing a review for an assignment or something? Is that the context?
Uh, that's appropriate, but mostly, I mean, once you're no longer having your articles in your because in many classes journal articles are provided as part of the assignment, and you're going to consume, you're going to read those, and that those are reliable. But now I'm asking you for when you yourself are selecting what you consider to be appropriate articles, the level of scrutiny you have to give that because now you are the only safeguard and quality control in that respect. So I think
Yeah.
that adds a different level of examination.
Yeah, I think, well, then I will answer that question or make a point using an article review assignment as a way to do that. And this is why in my classes, I'm sure students initially probably have a sinking feeling when they see how many article reviews I have them do in a class, but by the end, they really start enjoying it and they find out, hey, this is a really efficient way to make informed decisions about articles. And what why I do with the article review assignments, and you can do this on your own, when you're trying to determine what you're going to use and how you're going to use it to develop your literature review, for example.
Mhm.
Summarize it, the best you can. Fewer words, the better. Don't leave out any important points, but summarize it succinctly. Define the terms and constructs, how they're defined in there. And you can almost do this in a bullet style if you needed to, just for efficiency. And then the second section is where you could critique it. How does it line up with other research you've read in this area? What do you see as the weaknesses of it? How to, compare and contrast it to other sources. And then also, again, what are the flaws in the study or what are the strengths or, and then finally, how are you going to apply it either in a research setting or in a practice setting? So I think if you do those three steps, then, you've done a pretty thorough job of making decisions, about the quality of the article, the usefulness of the article, the application of the article.
I think that's a very good approach that you want to perform a summarize the article, as you say, an article review. We actually you discuss the argument that the article makes, note its weaknesses or gaps or whatever, and then the implications for it. Absolutely.
And I would also say, don't forget, what are the research questions and what's the purpose of the study? I almost forgot that. That's paramount. Why was the study undertaken and what are the main research questions that it's trying to answer?
So when we're conducting a summary of research, as you say, capturing a 25-page article down to a single sheet of paper is enormously helpful, and
It
this is a
is.
great exercise. I would just add to that just a few things that I think are important questions to ask while we're doing it to provide that level of scrutiny that I was getting at. So I want to first get an understanding to the best I can about what assumptions the researcher is making, because every study does come with certain assumptions which may or may not have a lot of validity, and I want to at least capture that, because one of the best ways to evaluate if the study is well grounded is questioning those assumptions and making sure that they are well founded.
Yeah.
That's the first step.
Yeah.
Also, the next thing I want to look for is before I am before I delve too much into the results, I want to examine how the sample was constructed.
Mm,
And was it truly a good representative piece of the overall population that it's
mhm.
suggests that it's trying to mimic? And sometimes you'll see that, oh, I see that we gathered all the subjects from this place here, and as you consider it in your head here, there may be an embedded bias somewhere in that, and that's an important thing to always critique as well. Is the sample likely to have a blind spot to it?
Yeah. Great point, Nick.
The next thing I would say is that if for some reason, if I read after I've read the abstract, if some of the claims in there surprise me, I'm more inclined to delve into the results sections first,
Mm,
and prior to reading their discussion, and see if I can predict what they're going to say. Because if I'm looking at the data and I arrive at a different interpretation than what they do, I want to try and arrive at before I have my own perspective colored by what they said.
yeah.
Because ideally, if we've both done our jobs correctly, we both should be close to the same interpretation. So,
Hmm.
and unfortunately, uh, we should also be trying to do the same thing when we agree with the comments too, which is
Hmm.
that we a lot of us have to have to take a more active role into providing uh, a degree of scrutiny and suspicion for all claims, whether they naturally align with what we think or not. So that's part of it. That's often a harder challenge than what we. It's easier to be said and done in many cases. So
Yeah. Great
uh,
points. Excellent.
one, I guess one more thing I would say, I also, as I finish consuming the results section and looking at the implication section, I'm going to ask myself, do these implications and these implications alone necessarily proceed from the results? Or is there an alternative explanation for these data?
Mm,
Because I think that's an important thing. Because a lot of us we find an answer that appeals to us, but we exclude all others, and that is where we get into trouble. Because then we have a tendency to overgeneralize our results, and it may not actually be logically valid.
yeah. John Antonakis, who's one of my absolute favorite researchers, talks about how, you know, we have to always question, are we even studying the right variables? And this is kind of your point where I think they're called exogenous variables. They're things that,
Exogenous, yeah.
yeah, yeah, there we go. Exactly. And he used the um, analogy of like a skeet shooter, shooting skeet and not realizing over the horizon, there's all kinds of stuff going on, and he's shooting skeet right over, like a picnic or something like that. And he's saying that when we do the research, we're always trying to hit that target. We don't realize we're probably not even aware of the other variables or conditions that are beyond our limited sight. So that's really important to consider as well. Like what are we not seeing? What are we forgetting about? What's right in front of us that we're not even, considering? So
Absolutely. Well, I don't really have a whole much more to say about that. What other ideas or takeaways do you have for us today, Stephen?
um I guess the final thought on it is to and I think most people in a doctoral program get to the point where it starts off as kind of a love-hate relationship with the literature, and then it does kind of turn into a love affair with the topic or the whatever. And I think it's important that we always, when we're getting bogged down in it, we are having a hard time making the decisions that you and I just talked about. Take a break, step back, think about what you're doing, and really take a moment to appreciate that you're at a point where you get to read this research. We always joke about how few people actually read, articles out there. We work so hard to get published, and then maybe 10 people, read our article. But it doesn't matter. If you're lucky enough to be one of those people reading it, then you should count yourself really lucky. It's dancing on the head of a pin, and we should never forget, the privilege it is to read this, and also the accomplishment of being able to interpret it and using it in meaningful ways to move your field forward just a little bit.
That is by no means a small feat, because there's a very small group of people who actually have that capability, and to have the training to do that is valuable, and you'll find value in the marketplace too. So
Absolutely. So embrace the process. I think the tips that we've come up with today are really good, Nick, especially I think your insights were spot on, and I hope students and researchers come back and listen to this once in a while to remind themselves of the steps that you enumerated, and also those subtle questions you have to ask yourself as you're looking at the literature.
very good. Well, thank you all very much for listening today. And until next time, this has been Dr. Nick Wolf,
And Dr. Stephen Lindenberger,
reminding you all to think better.
think better.